Hello there, welcome to the Saraway channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing incredibly well. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much, and I'm so glad you've joined me for part 3 of our story tonight. So before we continue, don't forget to go and get yourself a lovely hot cup of cocoa and subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and by all means share these stories with anybody who appreciates a good story. So let's continue with part 3 of our story tonight. "Can Daddy see what I'm drawing now?" asked Christy in delight, glancing up at the ceiling. "Is he looking down at me from the window in heaven?" she said with a euphoric look on her face. "Can he see me now, Mummy?" "I'm sure he can see you," said Eartha. "I'm sure he's watching you right now, even as I speak, from that big window. And he's drinking a big mug of hot chocolate from the stream in heaven. I'm sure he's going to watch you every single day from now on, to make sure you don't get up to any mischief." "But I'm never naughty," said Christy. "Only the cat is naughty, but me and Benjamin, we're good, aren't we, Benjamin?" Benjamin nodded in agreement. "Guess what, Mummy? I'm going to draw Daddy an angel," said Christy, beginning to draw with great gusto, as if her life depended on it. "I'm going to draw Daddy an angel too," said Benjamin excitedly. "But mine is going to be much bigger than Christy's is. My angel is going to be as big as a skyscraper so it can reach up to heaven." "But my angel's going to be bigger than a skyscraper," boasted Christy competitively. It was Benjamin who now looked up at the ceiling and began to wave vigorously. "What are you doing, Benjamin?" Eartha asked curiously, rather amused by her son's bizarre behaviour. "I'm waving at Daddy, of course." For a moment he looked rather concerned. "He can see me through the ceiling, can't he, Mummy? It's not blocking the view from heaven, is it?" "But of course he can see you. He's in heaven, so he can see everything. There are no barriers." For a moment Eartha felt the tears rush into her eyes. "I think I need to go to the bathroom, children, for a moment," she said, very suddenly, dashing to the little cloakroom under the stairs, where she took sanctuary on the closed lid of the toilet seat. She stuffed her mouth with toilet paper, so her throbbing, deep guttural cries could not be heard by her children. She certainly did not want her 2 children to pick up on her grief. She couldn't let them see her like this, with red puffy eyes, looking so downcast and dishevelled. In that quintessential moment, Eartha's wistful memory seemed to shift back to her childhood. For a brief moment, she recalled herself as a 9-year-old girl. Their family dog, Sylvester, had died of old age. It was a sudden heart attack. Eartha had found him curled up in his basket, not moving, when moments before he had simply trotted over to the water bowl to drink some water. At that time, they had a Jack Russell Terrier called Magpie, and Eartha had told her mother that she needed to show Magpie that Sylvester was dead, because Magpie needed to know the truth. Eartha had been more than a little bewildered when Magpie had simply sniffed his deceased best friend, lying there unflinching and unmoving in his doggy basket, and then just nonchalantly trotted away, almost as if Sylvester's death was perfectly normal. He'd rushed off to get his ball, in the hope that Eartha would play with him. He had dropped the ball at her feet in expectation. "Why isn't Magpie sad, Mum? His best friend Sylvester is dead," she had asked her mother, looking decidedly puzzled. "He's not even crying, Mummy." She had expected Magpie to go into a corner looking very, very sad, rather than show an interest in chasing after a ball. Instead, Magpie was in an ebullient good mood, untroubled by the sad fate of his beloved friend. He began to run around the place with his tail wagging furiously, as if it was all water off a duck's back, that his doggy friend had passed away. And Magpie only seemed interested in playing with the ball. "Love," her mother had said, "I don't think dogs cry, do they? You see, they don't look on death like we do. They live in the moment." Eartha had never understood Magpie's nonchalance towards his best friend, yet right now Eartha believed her children were reacting to their father's death in much the same way that Magpie had reacted to Sylvester. "Your dad is not coming home," would soon likely be followed later in the afternoon by, "Mummy, can I have a cookie and some chocolate milk?" Eartha privately concluded to herself, as she reflected over these many things on the closed toilet seat in the cloakroom, that both animals and young children were so much more resilient about the brutality of death than adults obviously were. She envied her children's optimism as they carried on drawing without a care in the world. Yes, it was interesting for them that Dad had gone to heaven, but life still went on, didn't it? One day Eartha was in no uncertain doubt her two children would want to learn all they could about their late father, although by then she was sure they would barely remember him at all, and that made her feel very, very sad. When she told them about their late father, she'd be able to tell them what a wonderful and brave man he was. For not many a soul would have the stomach to deal with the hardened, brutal criminals that her husband had to face on his squad team on a regular basis. Of course, the squad teams always used the element of surprise to pounce on these predators of our society that preyed on the innocent and most vulnerable. Eartha couldn't help thinking there were aspects of little Benjamin that reminded her of her husband Nate. So even though Nate was now gone, he lived on in his own children. She was sure of that. The feel of the two gold wedding bands hanging side by side each other on the chain brought her a great deal of comfort. It made her think of Nate, and the feelings she felt were incredibly raw. The lugubrious melancholia she felt over his tragic passing was insurmountable, it would seem, but she knew she wasn't alone in her grief. All around the world there were others much like her, going through similar challenges, and her realizing she wasn't completely alone brought her a measure of comfort. Let's just say her husband Nate had been an upstanding member of the police squad team, who had lost his life so tragically in a drug raid that had gone badly awry. The squad team had a formidable reputation at bringing down some notorious criminals and gang members suspected of heinous acts, which included murder and drug trafficking. One day the police squad did a raid in the early hours of the morning on a residence, when all the drug traffickers were fast asleep in bed. They had broken down the front door and woken up the surprised members of the gang. There were 8 of them in the house, whom they had all cuffed, but one appeared to be missing. The squad team did a thorough investigation to search for the 9th drug trafficker and couldn't find him anywhere. They assumed he was not on the premises and believed they had secured the place. This drug trafficker must have been wide awake when the police successfully broke down the front door, or he would never have successfully found the time to hide himself in the closet that had already been checked by the police squad team. But unbeknown to them, there was a hidden compartment in that cupboard that they had failed to see, where the missing man was hiding. In a trice, this drug trafficker, who must have had a suicide wish of sorts, suddenly emerged from the closet rather unexpectedly. With all guns blazing, he had fired out several shots as he tried his best to exit the premises to make his escape. If he'd remained hidden, he'd have easily got away with not being arrested, so why he suddenly burst out of the closet was rather perturbing, to say the least. Some suggested that he possibly panicked. The drug trafficker was blown up at once by the police squad in what seemed like a second. Nate had been wearing body armour at the time, but one of the bullets that had been fired randomly at the squad by this drug trafficker had unfortunately ricocheted and hit Nate square in the femoral artery of his leg. The squad team had done their level best to try and save Nate's life in any way they could, and to stem the dreadful flow of bleeding, but the wound was so bad that Nate had bled out incredibly fast, and no amount of pressure on the wound seemed to help at all, because the bleeding was insistent. Apparently the room where Nate had died had smelt of copper from all the blood that he'd lost. Nate obviously realized in his last moments he absolutely was not going to make it. He had told his friends in the squad team to tell Eartha that he loved her and the children. He had died only minutes later. It was later that morning. 2 members of the squad team that Eartha knew very well arrived at her doorstep. She knew that her husband had only recently done a drug raid, so for them to arrive at her front doorstep was very sobering indeed. and they were there to deliver her the tragic news of her husband's demise, and all they could say to her is, "I'm very sorry, Eartha. We did everything we could. Your husband was such a good man." Eartha had known on spotting them, as they ambled up to her front door, that they were going to deliver to her the worst kind of news possible. In truth, Nate had always prepared Eartha emotionally for a tragedy like this to happen to him, because he knew it was a distinct possibility, as he was dealing with hardened criminals all the time. He knew he was always putting his life at perilous risk. But Eartha had never allowed herself to entertain such disquieting thoughts until they had all but become a cruel reality in her own life. As Eartha thought about her husband's tragic passing, she watched the rain pouring down in sheets. She knew that her best friend Rona was absolutely right, and that she should heed her salient advice. This was a new beginning for her and her children, and she needed to make her dreams a reality. She wanted to become a full-time potter, and that would never happen if she chose to squander her time with a prevailing sense of doubt. When intrepid climbers ascended Mount Everest, they didn't stop to think, "What if I can't do it? What if this happens or that happens?" Instead, they courageously, boldly took on the perilous weather conditions and the dangerous, treacherous hazards in order to achieve their goals. And if they could do it with scant regard towards their fear, then she could climb her own little Mount Everest. She just needed a little faith, that was all. The rain kept coming down in dogs and cats. In this breakthrough moment, Eartha decided that yes, this would indeed be a new beginning for the kids and herself. It had been an easy decision to leave their apartment in New York behind, and all the places and people that reminded her of her loss. Coming here to live in a lovely red-brick Georgian-style house close to the town of Newfield in Tompkins County, with its small population of people, really was like beginning again. She had started to make friends here, and that was a promising start. Her children were also making friends. She had been warmly welcomed into the small community, who sensed she was a woman on her own, that had been through a few storms. These caring people hadn't even asked her too many invasive questions, possibly realizing she wasn't ready to share yet, as to why she'd moved away from the bustle of New York. She had been invited to barbecues and get-togethers, and even made to feel as if she'd always belonged here, and she was glad she'd come to live in this part of the world. 2 of the locals had asked her for pottery lessons, and she had thought she might enjoy teaching people how to work behind a wheel with a ball of clay. When she had first laid eyes on the red-brick farmhouse and the barn that she had converted into a pottery studio, moving here had seemed like the right thing to do, almost as if Nate himself was guiding her to do this. She realized that working in a pottery studio, overlooking the idyllic views of the woodgrove, would certainly inspire her creativity. This was the quintessential opportunity she'd been waiting for all her life, to create pottery that she could sell, and she could make a good living out of it for herself. And with her newfound financial freedom, she could really enjoy pursuing this passion of hers. So acquiring a nanny to move in to help with taking care of her children was something she needed to do. "I can do this," she told herself, as she watched the small mustard-coloured Peugeot roll up the driveway, while the rain continued to bucket down. She crinkled up her eyes to see if she could observe the person seated in the front seat of the car, which she assumed must be the first nanny applying for the job. It was probably Bertha Ferris, and she'd be seeing more applicants today. It was a promising start, because Bertha Ferris was 5 minutes early, and promptness was always important. The day had turned out not quite as badly as she had expected, and all the nannies she had interviewed for the position had been completely different and as varied as the colours and flavours you would find in a packet of jelly beans. Bertha Ferris had arrived at the door very promptly, sporting a big black umbrella. She was a girl that had come highly recommended by the agency. She looked as if she was nothing more than 18 years old, rather than her 28 years of age. But when she checked Bertha's papers, they affirmed very clearly that this young lady, who looked as if she should be in senior high, was indeed 28. "So tell me about yourself," Eartha had asked the young lady. "If you don't mind my saying so, I hope I don't sound desperately rude. but you look so much younger than your 28 years. I thought you were only about 18. Bertha looked awkward and slightly embarrassed. Her skin began to pinken. She sat there on the sofa, her back as erect as a pencil, and her big brown eyes nervously glancing around the living room, almost as if she half expected something to jump out of the shadows and scare the bejesus out of her. Even in this interview, she looked rather like a deer caught in headlights, but maybe she was just a tad nervous, Eartha thought. "That's what everybody says," said Bertha. "If I go to a bar, sometimes I have to prove my age. It's terribly embarrassing, you know, because nobody ever believes I'm 28. It drives me mad." Eartha studied Bertha's curriculum vitae for a moment, while everything remained silent in the living room. Finally she looked up from the paper. "I see you've been a nanny for 2 other families. They both appear to have given you glowing references, which is a very good sign. It would seem you come highly recommended. Why did you leave your previous employments, if you don't mind my asking?" "Well, the first job I worked for was with a very nice couple called the Wallaces. They were amazing. They had 3 children, but they moved. You see, the father got a transfer to a job in Vancouver, and I didn't want to move that far away from New York. So I decided not to go with them. I was fond of the children, of course, and they were a great family to work for. I really enjoyed working for them. They were very good people. They made me feel as if I belonged with their family. I looked after a 3-year-old girl called Annie, a little boy called Robert, and another boy called Ferren, and they were such well-behaved kids. It was a pleasure to look after them." "I see. And what about this other, more recent nanny job you acquired? Why did you leave that, if you don't mind my asking?" "Well, I did enjoy working for the Robinson family, but when I got the job it was under the understanding that I got the weekends off, but they kept reneging on their word by insisting I worked every weekend, so I never got any time off, and that really bothered me. I'd be told I could go off on a Saturday and Sunday, and then Mrs. Robinson would suddenly change her mind at the very last minute and say she needed me, and could I please stay. She'd tell me she wouldn't mess me around again, but then she did, over and over again. She was very presumptuous, hot-tempered and extremely manipulative. It was very difficult to refuse her. She was a defence attorney, you see. She was a demanding woman by nature, and always made me feel as if I was in the wrong if I wanted time off. She would say to me, 'Can't you see I'm so busy? I've got so much on my plate. Are you really going to expect me to look after my children when I pay you so well?' She didn't seem to know the meaning of the word no, I'm afraid. She took advantage of me because I'm by nature quite shy. I've always been a bit of a people-pleaser, you see. In the end, I would work every single weekend, and it all got too much for me. So I made up an excuse as why I had to leave for good, so that she'd give me an excellent reference, which she did. I didn't want to rub the woman up the wrong way, because let's just say if you make an enemy out of Mrs. Robinson, she'd probably ruin you for life. She had lots of friends in high places. It became extremely awkward for me, so that's why I gave in my notice. I just had to have some time for myself." "Of course you need time for yourself. Everybody does. It sounds as if this dreadful woman took advantage of you, and that is not good. That won't happen with me, I can assure you of that. You will get your weekends." "Well, I guess it happens," said Bertha, shaking her head sadly. "I liked her kids very much. They were sweet, but the parents, well, they were both professionals, and everything seemed to revolve around them. They had no time for their children. They were the kind of couple you wonder why they had children in the first place. I'm not the only nanny that has been exploited like this, I suppose, and I won't be the last. I've heard lots of stories, you know, but I care not to repeat them. I know people worry about who they hire as a nanny, but from a nanny's perspective, the type of people you work for is equally as significant. If you must know, my agency contacted me about this job that you're offering. They said they'd interviewed you, and that you seemed a very nice person, and they also told me I'd get the weekends off, and that means a whole lot to me. It's important for me to see friends and family. That's all." "Of course it's important," Eartha agreed. "So tell me, Bertha, why did you decide to become a nanny in the first place?" "Because I love children. I love looking after kids. It's all I've ever wanted to do all my life, since I was very little. In truth, I guess I'm a big kid myself. I love to play games with children, and I enjoy looking after them. But in the same breath, I am very reliable, and I can be trusted to handle the most rambunctious and testy of children. Well, I'm glad to hear that, Bertha, because I do need someone reliable and extremely trustworthy for this nanny position, as you can appreciate. The nanny I hire will be required to look after my children and transport them to extracurricular activities during the day. I'm looking for someone to move in with us. I have a spare bedroom en suite for the lady who acquires the job, but I need them to be around during the week to manage my children's needs. I won't be leaving the premises unless I'm going to town for shopping or meeting up with a friend, so if you need anything, I will be working in my pottery studio on the property. I'm sure you saw the barn that overlooks the trees. I've converted that into a pottery studio. I will be working from there. You're a potter? That's right, I am. I've been doing pottery since I was 13 years old. My father introduced me to the craft, and I never looked back. Wow, that's absolutely amazing! Your husband, where is he? Asked Bertha, her eyes looking directly into Eartha's. Is he also going to be working on the property? Or does he work away from the house? I don't have a husband any more, said Eartha coyly, beginning to fiddle with the rings around her neck. He died, I'm afraid, over a year ago in a tragic accident. I prefer not to talk about it if you don't mind. But of course, I'm so sorry. Oh, don't be. It's important you know these things about me. You can see why I need to find the right person for this job as a single mother. I can't pursue my pottery career without the extra help. But of course, Mrs. Mackerson. Would you like to see the children? Asked Eartha. They're playing in the nursery together. Of course, I'd love to see them, said Bertha eagerly. After all, if you hire me, they'll be my full-time responsibility during the week, while you're working in your studio. Eartha had been extremely impressed with the way Bertha had interacted with her children, who seemed to have liked her at once and invited her to play with them. I want to show you my dollies, Bertha, Christy had said proudly, leading Bertha by the hand to show her her vast collection of dolls. They're so lovely. I love playing with dolls, she had said to a delighted Christy. Moments later, Bertha was sitting down with Benjamin, playing with his toy train, and getting quite animated about it, almost as if she forgot that Eartha was even there. And in that quintessential moment, as shy and as fresh-faced as Bertha may appear, as far as Eartha was concerned, this young woman ticked the right boxes for the job, and Eartha knew at once that she was the one. Of course she had to interview the other applicants before she made any final decisions. The second applicant was a woman called Mrs. Rosamond, and she was in her early 60s, was reasonably stout. She wore an old-fashioned tweed skirt and jacket, had never been married a day in her life, and had a no-nonsense disposition. Don't you worry, Mrs. Mackerson. Those kids of yours will be taught real manners with me in charge. I don't stand for any nonsense. These days kids are not raised right at all. The parents let them get away with everything, I find. But don't you worry, Mrs. Mackerson. The children under my charge will be seen and not heard, if you know what I mean, she said rather proudly. Eartha didn't know what the woman meant, and didn't want to either. She could sense that Mrs. Rosamond would be a tough taskmaster who'd stand for no nonsense, and while some parents might like that, Eartha wanted to hire someone her children would actually like. The last thing she wanted for her children was to be miserable in the company of their nanny. All the other applicants she interviewed had quirky characteristics. One arrived for the interview, sporting a bright pink hairstyle. She was wearing a tartan mini skirt, dark black fishnet stockings, black lipstick on her lips, and high-heeled combat boots. She seemed nice enough, but judging by the way she presented herself, Eartha was not entirely sure she could trust this girl. She seemed a little on the flaky side, and spent half the interview looking down at her cell phone to check her messages, which seemed rather inappropriate. In the end, it was an easy choice for Eartha to make, so she was delighted to offer Bertha the job. Within a short space of time, Bertha had settled in with the family rather seamlessly. and Eartha wondered to herself what all the fuss had been about. Why had she been so desperately worried about recruiting a nanny? Bertha had been such a godsend. She was incredibly good with the children. She had a youthful energy, and these days she seemed to have come out of her shell a little. Eartha had been met with a cacophony of I told you so's from Rona, but she didn't care a jot about that. She was delighted that things were working out well with the new nanny. "Didn't I say," Rona boasted, "that you'd find the perfect person to look after the kids? Am I right or am I right, Eartha? You don't need to gloat, Rona. It just doesn't suit you." "Oh, but I do. Let's hear it from you." "All right, I admit it. You were right, Rona. I'm very pleased with the new nanny. She seems terribly nice. She's very young looking for her age, but she came with glowing references, and so far I'm very happy with her. And the kids appear to like her too." "Well, if the kids like her, it's a flying start, is it not?" "Of course it is. But it's early days, is it not? But I do feel as if a great big weight has been lifted off my mind." "Of course you do. You needed all the help you could get, and now you have it. And by the sounds of things you've found someone you can trust. So it doesn't get better than that." "Well, I must admit, it is lovely just to focus on my pottery, without worrying about the children." So there you are. That is the end of part 3 of our story. Part 4 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.